epically, if one can call it that, he managed to stay ahead of the might of Maranello.
From Autosport.com and Autosport magazine, I'm Kevin Turner, and this is the Autosport podcast. Welcome to the latest episode of our look at the greatest World Championship Grand Prix since 1950s. We've got over 1,100 races that we've sifted through to pick out the best 100, broken down into 10 episodes to match the 10 chapters of a book that we will be talking about in a moment. I'd like to introduce my special guests to talk about these choices and argue and debate and discuss the details. And first of all, it's somebody who helps us with this, Karun Chandhok. Welcome to the Autosport podcast. How are you doing? And are you looking forward to dissecting our choices?
I'm good, thank you. It's been a busy F1 season, as you know. But, you know, it's so hard to try and pick the greatest race of all time. So I really enjoyed, the method of picking 10 chapters. At least we then only have to pick 10 at a time, and then narrow it down to one of those 10.
Which we'll do in the final episode.
Exactly. But it's been fun, and I can't wait to get stuck in.
And I should say that really we played bit parts in this, so I would say if that's fair. The man that actually did most of the hard work for this is Roger Smith. Roger, welcome to our podcast again. How are you finding it so far?
You underplay both of your roles, I'm sure. But yes, I did put it together and sort of led the charge a bit. But it's going quite nicely, I think, this podcast episode as a result of the book, and I'm enjoying it.
Epics is the title of this episode in this chapter. So what were you particularly looking for with epics?
Yes, it's a word that can embrace a number of different things.
Oh, it's fantastically vague in a way, isn't it?
It is a bit, and that's why it probably needs a bit of explanation. The subtitle we have in the chapter of the book is Against the Odds. In other words, these are victories when probably, they're less likely to happen than one would normally find. And another thing which comes up quite frequently, and I think that Karun might be able to help us a little bit, is a word called racecraft comes into it. So this is when champions, particularly champions, do show that sort of extra dimension in the way that they're able to drive and bring something to the party, which often results in an unexpected victory. So these are sort of legendary, heroic type races, which I hope we'll find as we go through them is the case.
Well, let's get into the list. So this is appropriate one really to kick us off at number 10. So the 1965 British Grand Prix. What's the crux, Roger, for why this one's here?
I'd like to say because I was there at the time, but it's not just that. It's going back to that thing of racecraft where Clark had an enormous lead, as he so often did, in his number of British Grand Prix victories. This was, I think, his fourth, and he had a 35-second lead, and 20 laps from the end, his Climax motor began to show problems, and this is where he was, sort of magnificent, is the fact that he switched the motor off as he went round the corners to avoid the oil surge, which might have crippled the car completely, and kept the thing going and motoring to the end. With dear old Graham Hill, I say dear old simply because, he was always, well, not always playing second string, but, they had a wonderful, rivalry together over a number of years. Was trying to catch him, but his brakes were failing at the time. And so there was this wonderful thing in the papers the following day that says, "Can't go beats can't stop."
That is rather good, isn't it?
And it's a nice headline.
I mean, Karun, you've got experience with some of these older cars. Can you imagine the closing stages of Grand Prix and having to turn the ignition on and off through the corners? I mean, that's incredible mechanical sympathy, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've driven the Lotus 49, which obviously came a couple of years after this, but sort of similar era of cars, or similar decade at least. And the need for a driver to have mechanical sympathy was so important to success. We're talking about 65, which I think we can all agree is still the greatest motor racing season by a driver in living memory,
yes,
right?
Must be.
Indy 500 winner, World Championship winner, Tasman Series, French F2 Championship. Yeah. I don't know how many touring car races he won that year. It is the greatest season of all time. But I think, you know what this made me think of was rallying. You know, rally drivers, we often see wheels hanging off and navigators or co-drivers sitting in the bonnet and hanging out. You know, they do anything to get to the finish line and somehow make it happen. And it's almost that sort of mentality, isn't it? Is, okay, here's the problem. How am I going to drive around the problem and still get to the finish line and still achieve that result? And I do think the fact that drivers of that era, and it wasn't, of course, not just Clark, but all of those drivers, they had a versatility about them. They jump in and out of different cars, as was epitomized in that season. I think that probably helped in the fact that he had to think outside the box of how to get this car to the finish. But yeah, you know, very, very, very special result, really.
For me, it's almost the epitome. Karun Chandhok, obviously one of the great designers, no question. Lotus, fantastic team and constructor. But I do think that probably at this period, Clark's incredible gentleness with the car while being quick contributed perhaps more than it gets credit for. Not just the speed, but the softness with them, because the Lotus was quite fragile for most of the 60s. And this is almost the ultimate example of he got a car home that maybe most other drivers wouldn't have done.
Because he lost a lot of races in the last stages, but this is the one where he actually sort of, you know, got it home, and it was tremendous to watch because the crowd was so involved. As Graham and he, you know, that you could, all the stopwatches were out in those days. You know, everyone had a stopwatch by the track, and you know, you could see the gap closing, and the crowd was going wild.
Where were you watching from?
I was watching from Abbey.
Now, am I right in saying, it's probably in the book, didn't Graham set the fastest lap on the last lap?
He did.
Despite having no brakes.
He did, yeah.
So a bit of a shout out to him as well. Obviously had a sniff of victory and raised his game despite the fact the car wasn't up to it. So any objections to that being in there? It's kind
I think it's, you know, moving on.
So number 9 is the 1975 Dutch Grand Prix, the James Hunt's win with Hesketh. So Roger, what was the kind of real reason to get this one into the list?
Well, I had a bit of trouble getting it in, if I remember rightly, because I was pushing for it quite strongly as being an epic. And I wasn't saying you were disagreeing entirely, but it wasn't first on your list, and I think you had to think about it a bit more before you agreed.
Probably one of those, actually, this is a general point about the series and the book, isn't it? There are some races that could probably have been in other chapters or other.
Yes.
There are a few that overlap. Like we talked about the 2010 Chinese Grand Prix in a previous episode, that could have been in the wet weather one or the Jules one. So perhaps it was a victim of that a little bit, but definitely good to get it in here.
But certainly, you know, he had an early tyre change, which, you know, set him up for a victory. And as Murray would have said, catching is one thing, passing is another, because Lauda caught him up about 10 seconds, I think, when he had a run at him. But it was the way that Hunt managed to sort of keep ahead, because at the time, you know, this is a tiny little team, Hesketh, and it was a very exciting moment, obviously, that epically, if one can call it that, he managed to stay ahead of the might of Maranello.
You know, think of the context. You're thinking about the mighty Ferrari, and at that time they were mighty Ferrari.
Yes,
they were. This is peak Lauda, Montezemolo era for Gary. You know, that sort of stuff. And then you've got this team run by a British aristocrat who's sort of, you know, they're out there and they've got this left field driver choice they've gone for, and he's suddenly winning World Championship Grand Prix. It is an amazing story.
This appeals to me for two reasons. One, this is, I would say, the final. It's not the first F1 race he won, of course, because he'd already won international trophy. Yeah, here again. Yeah,
yes. Non-championship, though.
Non-championship race. But it's really him losing, I think, that Hunt the shunt problematic. You know, to hold off Niki Lauda. Okay, so Lauda didn't yet at that point have the reputation that he has now, but it was obvious that he was proper. So to hold him off, I think probably people would have been surprised about that at the time. But also, I wonder if this is almost inventing that early switch to slicks. Because slicks had only come in 1971. It's only 4 years later. I can't think of an early example of someone using I'm going to switch to slicks early, get up to speed, the sort of Jensen Button trick I like to do, because I mean half of these Grand Prix wins seem to be doing that, didn't it? So I also thought it was kind of an interesting just a start of a strategy that we're now really familiar with.
Well, I mean, it also takes a driver to deliver that, right? Because, you know, in modern Grand Prix racing, one driver pits before the other. We talk about the crucial lap and how one lap can make a difference of 3-4 seconds. He pitted 6 laps before Ferrari decided Lauda needed to change. So, you know, for those 6 laps, he had to hang on to it on slick tires in what were suboptimal conditions, shall we say, and made it work for him. So, you know, respect where it's due.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move on to number 8, which is the 2003 British Grand Prix, so another Silverstone race. I reckon this is probably Rubens Barrichello's best drive in F1. I've not actually done that list. Perhaps that's something. Perhaps I'll talk to him about
another list.
See if he agrees. Yeah. So Roger, what I mean, this was a dramatic. Well, this was an epic race. This could have been in the Crazy Races episode as well, I think. So yeah, what stuck out for you?
It's certainly not the deranged priest who caused one of the safety cars at the time.
No, quite.
But
really? that is my first memory.
That is one of the memories of that particular race.
Stands out for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
Barrichello was pretty good at winning races. That whether it had a track invader, because his first Grand Prix in Hockenheim was the same thing, wasn't it?
One of the things, apart from the fact that he recovered from a really bad start, he was on pole, and you know things hadn't gone well in the early stages, but he made his way through and you know sort of cut through the field and got into the position to challenge Raikkonen. But the overtake of Raikkonen was wonderful. Started at Stowe and ended at Bridge, I think. You know, they were together and gradually it sort of wound out and he was ahead. And you know, then he went away, and you know, Schumacher was in a Ferrari, was also in the field, so that's pretty remarkable. And he could do that from time to time, and he was so overshadowed by Schumacher that it was nice to sort of see him, you know, get some reference in the book of 100 Great Races.
It was a brilliant drive from Rubens, wasn't it? It was just, you know, he was always good, I felt, at Silverstone, wasn't he? Maybe it goes back to his days of racing in junior formula here, obviously British F3 champion in 91, and he's got a lot of history of testing for Jordan and Stewart. He spent a lot of time driving around Silverstone, and he was always a bit special around here.
He's one of those, I mean, the great drivers are great all the time, or most of the time, aren't they? But there are some very, very, very good drivers who occasionally could get to that level. Barrichello feels like one of those drivers to me. Really. On his day, I don't think anyone was going to beat him that day. It reminds me of Gerhard Berger at Hockenheim in 1997. I don't think it mattered what happened that day. He was going to win that race, and it felt a little bit the same with Barrichello at Silverstone.
They're in that next group, aren't they? Or, you know, like David Coulthard, remember? He had some amazing Magny-Cours races, for example.
Grand Prix, yeah.
You know, they had these amazing highs where nobody's going to beat them. Jarno Trulli, Monaco 2004, was incredible. You know, there was a certain days where the stars aligned, and they were amazing. And you know, as you say, that puts them in the category of very, very good Formula One drivers, multiple Grand Prix winners, a lot of them, but not quite in the Senna, Prost, Hamilton, Schumacher sort of category.
He's one of only 2 non-champions in this particular list of 10. And the other one we'll come to. But I think that's making the point you're making, you know, sort of nearly there.
Yep.
Not a great, but certainly on his day, you know, doing something remarkable.
Whereas the other driver, non-champion on this list, I would argue, is a great, even though he's not a champion. But
well, I think you might
a little bit later.
I think we wouldn't disagree.
If we're talking about the greats, Lewis Hamilton, I think, will come into the conversation fairly swiftly. So the 2021 Brazilian Grand Prix. We're recording this not that long after Max Verstappen's charge through the field in the 2025 race into Lagos. But Hamilton came through the entire field, having started at the back of the sprint race, then coming through to 5th, I think, then going back to 10th for the main Grand Prix, then coming through again, being run off the road by Verstappen. I'm not going to make any apologies for saying that, because that's definitely what happened, and still came back in and won the race. So it's just, Roger, it's got to be one of Hamilton's greatest drives, and that really is saying something. So I think you said in the previous episode, a great driver putting in one of their greatest races is automatically going to be a candidate for a list like this.
It does, and it was quite phenomenal the way he did do, as you said, through the sprint race, you know, sort of got up to P5, and then that was his starting position, reduced to P10 because of an engine change, and then, you know, sort of got through to win the race. the thing I've written down in a note here is, how was it that Verstappen didn't get penalised? Now, I know that's probably a bit controversial, but that was the occasion when I mean, they both went off together, sort of very far off the track, and you couldn't understand almost what was happening.
Well, Karun, you have to analyse these sorts of incidents every other week, don't you? So, so what was your take on it?
I mean, I was confused about why Max hadn't been penalised at turn 4 for forcing another driver off the track. But
do you think he would now?
I think so. I think so. I think the stewards. I remember speaking to the stewards at the one of the subsequent races. Must have been Qatar or no, it would have been Saudi or Abu Dhabi, I guess, in that run. Anyway, but on reflection, I think even they realised that they needed to do something there because it was getting a little bit silly. But I think more broadly, it was a weekend where, to me, I look at it and go, that's probably Lewis's greatest dry weather performance as a weekend, because we've seen great drives, Turkey in the wet or damp conditions. Here at Silverstone 2008, I'd still put down as his greatest victory. But
I think I would too.
And in terms of dry weather performances, that's got to be, I think, the standout for me.
It's that or Monza 2018 for me, where he single-handedly basically does over Ferrari, doesn't he? On a day where they're 1-2 on the grid.
Yes.
And I think they're the two standout dry runs for, which is ridiculous in 300 and something races.
Yeah, but I think this one is more important because of the context of what happened. Lewis, there was a lot of bad blood that year between Mercedes and Red Bull, and it kind of boiled over that weekend about this rear wing thing. Max having a look at the rear wing in Parc Fermé, and then Red Bull making a little bit of a nudge, wink to the FIA, saying we think that's illegal. Then Lewis getting thrown out, and for something that was really, was it a performance advantage? No. Was it illegal? Depends who you speak to. Mercedes, even today, believe that should not have been thrown out, that it was within tolerance. So, there was so much going on that weekend. And then, obviously, I think Lewis is a driver, a bit like Mansell, when he feels the world is against him and he feels that there's an injustice, he rises to the occasion. He feeds off that energy that I will rise up against it and deliver against this perceived injustice against me. And to me, that's why that weekend was special, was he carried that load mentally and then executed an incredible performance in both the sprint and the Grand Prix.
It was almost a peak of the Mercedes-Hamilton comeback that season, wasn't it, to get them really back into championship contention again, obviously because Verstappen had built up a bit of a lead.
Still I rise, is the tattoo he has. He does fight back, always.
Yeah.
Number 6 is the 1988 Japanese Grand Prix. And I mean, it's, if you could imagine a way of winning a world championship, this has got to be one of the ways that you would want to win it. So, Roger, this is Ayrton Senna, one of his great drives, securing his first world title.
The first season of Prost versus Senna, and Senna came out on top with this drive. Drizzle, helped him make Prost look fairly ordinary in many ways, because he caught him by leaps and bounds. He was just on another planet almost. 13 seconds recovered over 15 laps, and he'd stalled from pole position, inevitably his pole position, and still, during the race, one thought, oh well, this is quite a good thing that Senna's not going to sort of win this one, because it takes it down to the final in Suzuka, but it didn't get to Suzuka.
Adelaide.
Adelaide.
This was at Suzuka. Adelaide was the finale, which Prost did win.
Yeah. And so the fact that he won there was quite remarkable, I think, and truly epic.
And Karun, the drizzle actually was quite crucial. When you look at the times, although he's coming through, Prost kind of, you think that buffer is enough in the dry. If it's a straight dry race, as we'd seen early in the season, whichever one of them got a lead, that was it. But the drizzle played more to Senna's strengths than it did Prost. Now, I think Prost also towards the end had a bit of a slight gearbox glitch as well, which took the edge off. But it is a great Senna drives in to go and win the championship like that.
Yeah, and I think you have to think about the context of the big picture. This was Senna chasing his first ever world championship. He he knew as he lined up on pole position, this was his first opportunity to seal that title and then he stalled, and it would have been very easy to get flustered and then let it go into a spiral, but he just picked his way through. I mean, at that stage, the MP44 was so much better than anything else on the grid. He blasted through the rest of the field. So to me, it's almost like actually those other cars didn't really matter. I know he dropped down to 14, but really 13.
It was the time loss.
It was a time
really?
loss. Yeah, the fact that he was 13 seconds to cross, as you say, in 5 laps. That's really the target. There's just a bunch of chicanes on the way, extra chicanes on the way that he had to get through. But yeah, the pressure to come back.
The presence of mind to bump start as well.
Because a little bit of luck being on a downhill grid.
Little bit of luck
on the tracks where it might not go away with it.
Yeah, exactly. But to overtake Prost on track and set himself up for the championship.
And I think we'd all agree that it was by far the most satisfactory one of their 3 Suzuka showdowns.
Oh yeah,
it got progressively worse from there, didn't it? So, but yeah, no, an absolutely epic performance. Fits the chapter perfectly, I think. In fact, I think that the winner of the next race could be described as epic in quite a few different ways over the years. Fernando Alonso winning the 2012 European Grand Prix on the Valencia street track. I mean, a race he shouldn't have won, basically, isn't it, Roger?
Yeah. I think that's what sums it up. Against the odds, he didn't have the fastest car. He'd qualified badly at P11, and he was there when Vettel went out on lap 34 or something to pick up the pieces and go on to win it. But it was also the fact it was in Spain, in Valencia, and the way he was embraced by the crowd sort of made it into an epic, and he took out a big lead at that time in the championship, and one really began to believe that he was going to get what he obviously deserved.
Which that car did not deserve.
No, that car did not deserve it, and he was going to carry that car and get to the end. Of course, it didn't happen that way because the Red Bull just blasted through for Vettel over the final rounds, one after the other. He won races.
Karun, for me, it's the incisiveness of the overtaking and the opportunism. Whenever he was presented with something, he just made it work for him in that race.
I mean, Alonso's been around F1 a long, long time now. And I still go back to this was his best ever season.
Yeah.
There was... And now, you actually look at it and go, and maybe this is another one of your lists of the best season put together by a single driver. It's got to be, I think, the best campaign put together by a driver who didn't win a championship. But this weekend summed it up. He stole opportunities that the car didn't deserve. And, in the book, you've got a fantastic picture of him on the podium there with Andrea Stella, who we now see, of course, as the team boss of McLaren. And I love the fact that Andrea was on the podium with 3 drivers who he engineered. Alonso winning, Raikkonen second, and obviously Michael Schumacher. And Andrea worked as an engineer for all 3 of them, which was fantastic and special day for him. But I remember
there's a lot of pleasure when you do these books in the selection of photographs, and I have to say that one I did enjoy finding this picture of Stella with Alonso.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant race, and I think it's not Fernando. You don't often see him. You see a fiery side of Fernando, but it's not often you see the sort of sentimental, emotional side of Fernando. But on that day, you did. He genuinely had tears in his eyes. It was an amazing day.
Right, well, let's move on to number 4, and it's another Lewis Hamilton race. It's the 2020 Turkish Grand Prix, which I think was a fantastic race to watch. I must admit, it was incredible. Although he ended up winning it by miles in the end, the winning margin was quite substantial. So, Roger, why is this one quite so high up the list?
Well, it was his ability to manage his stars, nurse his stars, whatever word you want to use, for so long. And he was up against, if I remember rightly, Perez, who was renowned as a tyre whisperer. And yet Perez, in a inferior car, possibly a Racing Point, but he was over 30 seconds behind at the end. And the tyres were sort of inters that were almost worn down and out. And in the report here, it says, as Vettel put it, it wasn't his race to win, and he still won it.
I remember that. That was brilliant. Yeah.
It was a crazy year because this was, of course, the COVID year. And,
Yes.
I remember we'd all heard that Turkey was going to be back on the calendar.
Well, a good track, actually.
Great track.
One of the great modern circuits, I think.
But of course, we'd not been there for many, many years. I think 2011 might have been the last time we'd been there. So we'd not been there for a long time. And they'd resurfaced it. So when we got there, I remember going around the track, and the surface, even when you walked on it, was so slick. And then they started to do a free practice, and you thought, oh God, there's just no grip. It was like ice racing. And then they saw the forecast, and it rained for qualifying. And so we had Lance Stroll on pole position, which, and fair play to Lance, he did a fantastic job.
Doesn't he?
I mean, he led half the race, didn't he?
Yeah. So, well, this was it, though. We saw him get pole, and we thought, oh yeah, great day, great result for him. But, the heavy hitters will pass him on the first 3 laps and be it. And then all of a sudden, they were edging away the 2 racing points, and the car was working well. And I remember being in the commentary box thinking, this is just completely mad. And Martin Brundle, Crofty, and I went there. We sort of looked at each other thinking, is this really going to happen? Like, are they actually going to win this? And I think there was a midpoint in the race where Lewis was 5th or something, and he was miles behind. You just thought, he's not making headway here. He's just stuck. The gap's opening up at the front. Alex Albon was in contention in the Red Bull at that time.
Yes,
wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. Yeah.
And you suddenly thought, we've got 2 racing points and Alex Albon in here. At that point, Perez hadn't yet won the Sakir Grand Prix.
No.
So it's like we got 3 drivers chasing their first win.
That's right.
And it's just not going to happen. But then, as it unfolded, they all started to pit, and Mercedes left Lewis out. And I remember we have this sort of setup of race control, what we call race control in the commentary box. We've got the timing screens, we've also got the onboards. I remember sitting on Lewis's onboard and watching the timing screens when everyone else had pitted, thinking, actually, his car looks all right. That he's got the pace here, and then you start looking at the timing screens and you think, wow, he's not dropping back. They're not catching him. He doesn't need to pit. And he just kept going and kept going and kept going. And then you started listening to the radio traffic. Again, we got a channel there, listen to the radio. And they kept saying, what do you think? And it's fine. Let's keep going. And before you know it, you thought, oh my goodness, he's just going to go to the end. He's going to win this. And it came out of completely nowhere.
And I think it's a race that half a dozen cars could have potentially won, which is why I put this up quite high. Because obviously in 2020, the W11 Mercedes won the great Grand Prix cars.
Yeah.
But on this day, I think there were half a dozen cars that could win. In fact, Max Verstappen was one of them and went off a couple of times.
Yeah.
Had a big old spin. And for me, this is still indicative. It's before the tipping point where the baton gets handed over. I think this is Hamilton. I am still number one at this point.
Yes,
I think it happens maybe during 2021. Debatable, obviously, definitely into the Grand Effect era. But that's, I think we're still at peak Hamilton at this point, aren't we? Very worthy.
So he clinched his 7th title at that particular race.
Yeah, what a way to do it. The top 3 epics. And they're all, I think, epic performances by one driver, really. Although the races themselves are all quite different. So number 3, the 1981 Spanish Grand Prix. This is Gilles Villeneuve. This is our other non-champion, but I think he's a great. So, Roger, what stands out for you in this one?
It's known, I'm sure, as the Gilles Convoy race, where he raced round with the cars behind him, sort of all in a column. You've got to remember that it only really happened because Jones, who'd brushed off into the distance in the Williams, flew off the track for some reason on lap 14. I don't think anyone's ever explained to me.
Just brain fade, I think.
I think it probably was. An error. But anyway, then Gilles, who'd started the race in P7, made a fantastic start, found himself in the lead, and it truly is the stuff of legends, I think, the way that he used the car so well. It was a little bit like, if I dare mention it, 1955 with Tony Brooks at Syracuse, when Brooks won in the Connaught with the Maserati behind him, and it was all about corners and straights. Then the Maserati won the straights.
One of the greatest non-championship F1 races, I think that would.
But it was that sort of race, and a classic for that.
For Karun, for me, this is one of the reasons I like this is Villeneuve kind of proving a lot of the criticisms that he still receives now, sometimes wrong, really, because you can't really be an error-strewn crash merchant with these cars behind you for the entire length of the Grand Prix, can you?
Yeah, that was it. He showed on that day that he's got the ability to mentally withstand pressure, mentally deliver a race-long performance without a lockup, without missing a gear, because that's all it would have taken for him to lose one position, and then he would have been offline, out of position, then the next one, then the next one, the next one. And he didn't. He soaked it up. I mean, I was thinking about it. It's just I notice here you got the time gap of 1.24 seconds for the top 5 at the finish line. How many races outside of Monza, and obviously safety car finishes, do you see a gap of the top 5 being that close? It's probably never happened.
No, probably not.
Not on a non-slipstream circuit.
If you take away a Monza or an Avis, tracks like that, but it's remarkable, right? And 5 different teams as well.
Yeah.
In that train.
And they had different occasions where different drivers, tried to take the lead from him, because there was a little bit of movement in the behind Villeneuve.
Yes, there was overtaking in the race, just not at the front.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of things I wanted to pick out about this one. One is, as well as that brilliant start, at the start of lap 2, he outbrakes Carlos Reutemann in a Williams in the Ferrari 126 CK. I mean, if I were Frank Williams or Patrick Head, I'd be having words. Like, come on, it's got three times the downforce that the Ferrari's got. How has he gone past you? And the other one is to make the point that the 126 CK was a bit of a truck in terms of the chassis. Obviously, incredibly powerful engine.
You can't say that. You'll get sacked.
I'm not employed by Ferrari, so it's fine. And yet, the 2 races that Villeneuve won that season, obviously the Spanish Grand Prix and the Monaco Grand Prix, are 2 of the 3 slowest venues on the calendar. Quite remarkable, really. So very worthy of its place. Well, I mean, do you agree that this is worthy of its place?
Absolutely. I mean, it had a great engine, I think.
Yes.
I think the chassis wasn't great, but the engine was good, which is really, to your point, the catalyst to him being able to hang on, wasn't it? Because he knew as long as he could get out of the corners straight enough and put the power down, people would now drag him, and he just sort of hung on that way.
Yeah.
Right, let's move on to another epic performance. Number 2 is the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix. Stirling Moss's, what I was going to say, his most famous victory. Not in motorsport, because I think his 55 Mille win is probably the best one or the most famous one. But in terms of Formula One, this is his sort of greatest drive, isn't it? Or regarded as his greatest drive.
So it was truly one of the epic races. And one of Moss's greatest, I'm sure. I think he may have said that himself, in fact. But he was up against the Ferraris, who were very powerful that particular season. And Ginther had gone away at the start, and yet he managed to reel him in, overtake him, and then hold the 2 Ferraris, Phil Hill and Richie Ginther, back for lap after lap, and pull away at times. Towards the end, Ferrari decided they should let Phil Hill ease off and let Ginther through to have a go. But even then, with Ginther chasing harder, Moss managed to keep the situation going, and it was a classic race. It lasted 2 hours 45 minutes.
I think he was quoted as saying that he kept expecting to be caught. He thought the Ferraris were messing around with him, and they never appeared. But I think there's some ridiculous statistic about, because he was basically on qualifying pace for the entire length of the Grand Prix, and I think his qualifying lap times by the number of laps would still only have been 40 odd seconds quicker than his actual race time, which is absolutely ludicrous if you think, Karun, now the gap between a qualifying lap and a race lap is enormous, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean,
Grand Prix.
It used to be 100 laps, wasn't it?
Yes.
The Monaco Grand Prix. It's now 78. But to do 100 qualifying laps with the pressure of 2 arguably quicker cars, would you say? The Ferrari at that point.
I would have thought so. I mean, they certainly showed the speed later in the season, but round Monaco, Moss was on pole.
Yeah. So the agility of the late.
So the agility around Monaco was in his favour, but they had 30 bhp more And you did feel that perhaps in the hands of somebody else they would have won, or in the hands of somebody else the Lotus wouldn't have won.
I mean, I think it's worth saying that Richie Ginther picked this as his race of my life, despite the fact that he finished second in theoretically a superior car. He says, well, I'll finish into second. To finishing second at Monaco to Sterling Moss, I don't think he's anything to be embarrassed about, which I think is probably fair enough.
Well, the fact that Sterling picked it as his best ever race, considering, so you got the stat here, he's won 212 races out of over 500. I mean, that, who are we to argue with that?
Yes, that's fair. Yeah, he used to, I think we asked him a couple of times that, and it was always either 61 Monaco or 55 Emilia, depending on, well, presumably whether it was a sports car or F1 that he was at when he was answering the question. Well, it was number one for a while, wasn't it, in our
to my mind it was, but that's because I'm a child of the 60s, and that probably influenced me a little bit. But I was there at this one as well, so I really and truly, I didn't mind this one going number one.
I mean, I think any one of these top three I would happily see at the top of any list, really. Number one is the 1993 European Grand Prix, which of course could have been in our wet weather one as well, but we had a different Senna race to put in there, which we'll come to in a later episode. So, Karun, I mean, it's probably Senna's most famous win, isn't it? Even though I would argue it's not his best, but it's the one that people think, certainly even from a British perspective, it's the one that people think about first.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many special things about that. The 93 season was a year where Senna was very reluctant to take part. He did this sort of race by race deal. He threatened to go to IndyCar. At this stage, he didn't have a contract for the rest of the season, I think, at Donington. And all of a sudden, he's now won two out of the first three Grand Prix, because he won in Interlagos before this, of course. It was an unbelievable race. I mean, it started off with that first lap, isn't it? There's a point where he's got a terrible getaway, and he's sort of fifth or sixth, depending on which camera angle you look at. Yes. And then all of a sudden, brilliant move around Vedlinger, Schumacher, past Damon into McLaren's, and then past Alain Prost. And, it's funny. I remember speaking with people at Williams a few years ago about this. And one of the things, I think it was Paddy Lowe who told me, was that they didn't have the right settings on the active car for the wet conditions. So the Williams was really not in the right window for it. But Senna ran rings around them. You look strategically, I think Williams did 6 pit stops for Damon and 7 for
That's
Prost,
right.
I think, something like that.
Exactly right.
And Damon's quote after the race was, we kept doing these pit stops, we kept choosing the wrong tyres, basically. And, McLaren and Senna, they chose the right tyres at the right points, but Senna drove those decisions. And, that was a kind of day which reminded McLaren and Marlboro why they needed Senna. And if he was going to cost you $1 million a race, that's what he was worth. And it was an epic race, an epic drive, really. In terms of the big story as well, right? We've only had one race at Donington in the World Championship era,
and it's in the list,
and it's in the list, and it was not, and it was, even today people talk about it as being one of the great wet weather drives.
I mean, shout out to the MP4A actually being a better car than it gets credit for, but more towards the end of the year, I think, when they really, it was actually genuinely a quick car in the dry by the end of 1993, but in the early part of the season, you do feel that it's probably Senna making a difference, because obviously Prost had just come back, and I think really conducted that season as I will do the minimum to win the championship. Yeah. I think what I would like to have seen is a Nigel Mansell Williams against Senna at McLaren at Donington 93, assuming they got the setup a bit more in the ballpark. I think that would have been an epic race for a different reason, perhaps.
I was in the grandstand opposite the pits, and you could see the Melbourne hairpin to the left. And so after they'd passed and coming round to complete the first lap, I saw Senna overtake Prost at the Melbourne hairpin, and there was a gasp from the crowd because nobody could believe that he'd made up those places in the way that he had. And of course, it was miserably wet at the time. We'd all been given a little flag saying, "Come on, Damon, come on," which we weren't waving at the time. But Damon actually did quite a good race on that.
Considering how inexperienced he was.
Yeah.
That and Interlagos.
Yes. So it was extraordinary. The other thing I remember was how confusing it was at stages, because you could see the top of the helmets going through the pits, and so many pit stops and people driving through the pits. I mean, Senna went through the pits once and they weren't ready, and he didn't even stop.
Set fastest lap doing that, I think.
I think he might have done.
Is that the only fastest lap in World Championship history set crossing the line in the pit lane?
I think it is.
Surely. Must be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing. But I think we should also give a shout out to Barrichello for this, because Senna, by that stage, already one of the all-time greats, 3-time world champion, peak of his powers, etc.
Not a surprise.
Not a surprise that he's and we know, at that stage, clearly the master of the wet conditions. The one who you wouldn't have expected was a rookie in a Jordan coming through the field and running in 4th place, wasn't it? It was an amazing performance.
Yeah, and I think car failed towards the very end, wasn't it? He had to wait quite a long time before he got another chance to get on the
P3 with 6 to go, then his Jordan failed. Yeah.
So potential podium. Well, that's our top 3 then. 1981 Spanish Grand Prix, the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix, and the 1993 European Grand Prix at Donington Park. Karun, I think, as obviously this is effectively the list that me and Roger put together. Anything in there, anything that was missed, or any order that particularly offends you on this one?
No, nothing particularly offends me, to be honest.
Yes. Success or failure, if you wanted to tune in to have an argument. Excellent stuff. Well, there might be some other races that you might regard as being epic, which will be in a future episode. But do drop me a line if you think we've got anything spectacularly wrong, or just want to make a suggestion of something that could have been in there. Kevin.turner@allsport.com. Thanks very much to Karun Chandhok for joining me and Roger. Thank you very much, Roger Smith, again. And thanks very much for listening. We'll be back soon with another Allsport podcast.